For nearly 7 years, I had been distant from my parents. A severed bond, one that began after my grandpa passed away. It was then that my mother, in a choice that cut me deep, let my stepfather take the reins of the family bookstore. And now, after all this time, they were asking for my help to rescue a business that seemed destined for ruin. I was just 28, a woman caught between the weight of memories and the pull of unresolved emotions. It was 7 years ago that I cut ties with them, a decision that seemed right at the time but has left a void I've never quite filled. My father, who passed away suddenly when I was only 3, had left a trail of unanswered questions. The shock of his passing had shattered our world, and the people who should have been there for us, his parents, turned their backs on my mother. After his death, she found herself alone, and for a time, it was just the two of us, living under my grandparents' roof. In those early years, my mother struggled. She hadn't worked since my birth, so finding a job was no easy feat. When she did manage to land something, it was low-paying, a grueling endeavor where she had to work twice as hard to bring in enough to support us. The bookstore, which my grandparents ran, had always been an option, but she brushed it off as something of a hobby. So, she worked at a stationery company, and over the next couple of years, she saved enough to finally get us a place of our own. When we moved out, it was just the two of us again. But by then, my mother's focus had shifted. She started dating again, something I wasn't entirely prepared for. As a child, I wasn't sure how to handle the idea of her moving on from my father. It made me uneasy, like I was being pushed aside for someone new. Even though I kept my feelings to myself, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Each new boyfriend felt like another person in a long line of faces that I didn't understand. Still, I remained quiet, putting on a face of acceptance. I thought maybe it was just a phase, something that would eventually pass, like the others before them. But then came Stephen. At first, he seemed like just another guy, and I figured it would be the same as before, just a few weeks of casual dating. But as months went by, I realized something was different. Stephen stuck around. He was serious about my mother, and, for the first time, she seemed to be putting real effort into her relationship. But as their connection grew deeper, something inside me started to stir. There was a change in her, something unsettling. She became different. When Stephen was around, she wasn't the same woman I knew. She was quieter, more eager to please him. I couldn't place my finger on it at the time, but I felt like I was losing her to someone I barely knew. She was a grown woman, and I had no right to question her choices, so I kept silent. But I couldn't ignore the way she transformed herself for him. Her behavior was like that of a teenager trying to impress a crush, desperate for approval. I felt like I was intruding in their world, even though they were just sitting together, doing nothing. I had never seen my mother act this way, not even with the other men she dated. With Stephen, it felt different. She was more passive, more willing to give up parts of herself. It wasn't the same woman I had known growing up. I never brought it up, not to her, and certainly not to my grandparents, though they would occasionally ask about him. I always told them what they wanted to hear, told them everything was fine, just as I thought my mother would want me to. But inside, I was disturbed. Then Stephen moved in. That's when things really started changing. He made it clear from the start that he didn't like the way our home looked. Everything had to change. The house, which had always been a neutral mix of feminine and masculine elements, now had to become gender neutral in his eyes. He turned our space into something I didn't even recognize. The once warm, lived-in rooms became cold and impersonal, like a bachelor pad. When it was all done, Stephen was proud. Proud of a space that, to me, didn't even feel like home anymore. But that was just the start. Stephen didn't stop there. He began making all sorts of changes in my mother's life. He convinced her to stop eating meat because, according to him, it was bad for her health. He even got her to quit sugar, something that had a profound effect on her mood. She became irritable, snapping at me for the smallest things. And it wasn't just about food, there were other things, too. He got into her head, turning every little detail into a reason for anxiety, convincing her to follow every health trend he read about online. He turned our lives upside down, and my mother, who had always been independent and strong, seemed to lose herself in his ideas. But even with all these changes, I kept quiet. I didn't want to rock the boat. It wasn't like he was forcing me to follow everything he believed in, and my room remained untouched. I didn't think I had a right to complain. Then, they got married. And that was when the real shift happened. When my mother told me she was quitting her job because she was pregnant again, I was both thrilled and uneasy. Of course, the thought of a new sibling excited me. What child wouldn't want that? But something didn't sit right with me about her decision to leave her job. Stephen, my stepfather, seemed to have this unshakable grip on her, and it raised alarms in my mind. Even though nothing overtly terrible had happened yet, the way she was handing over control to him felt dangerous. I couldn't just ignore it. I tried to talk to her over and over, urging her not to quit. But she was firm. "It's none of your business," she'd say, brushing me off. "You're a kid, stick to what kids do." How could she dismiss my concerns like that? I was part of this family too, but she just didn't seem to understand that. She didn't see that what she did affected me deeply. Still, I couldn't change her mind. So, I backed off, deciding that she was an adult and knew what was best for her. But it didn't sit well with me. The news of her miscarriage hit everyone hard. She was in her late 30s at the time, and the doctor blamed the complications on her age. Stephen, who was supposed to be her support, was devastated too. But instead of comforting her, he shut down. They stopped speaking, and for months, they were living like strangers under the same roof. I watched as the woman who should have had someone by her side was left alone in her grief. It was heartbreaking to see them barely exchange words, only communicating when absolutely necessary: bills, groceries, the bare minimum. That period was a dark one for our family. My mother, fragile and hurting, turned to me, and I found myself closer to her than I had ever been. But as soon as she began reaching out, Stephen's indifference toward her deepened, and before long, I found myself caught in the middle of a marriage unraveling. My grandmother had also fallen ill around the same time, which likely played a part in my mother's growing need for comfort. My grandparents were always there for me, especially after we'd moved away. But then, just a few months later, my grandmother passed, and the loss of two significant women in my life weighed heavily. Soon after the funeral, Stephen began making an effort to reconnect with my mother. He wanted to rebuild what they had, but for me, it was too late. He had already proven himself to be someone I could never trust again. My respect for him was gone, and it was hard to even look at him without remembering how he turned his back on my mother when she needed him most. The coldness he showed us both made it impossible to think of him as anything other than a stranger. A year passed, and I moved away to college. My mother and Stephen were in marriage counseling by then and seemed to be doing better. They tried to make the weekends work, and I divided my time between visiting her and my grandfather. He had become incredibly lonely after my grandmother's death, and I knew that I needed to be there for him. I'd started thinking about taking over the bookstore after I graduated, helping with finances and keeping the business afloat, but then tragedy struck again. A few weeks before my graduation, I got the call that my grandfather had passed away peacefully in his sleep. While I was relieved he didn't suffer, it stung that I never got the chance to say goodbye. But there was more to the story. On the day of his funeral, my mother informed me that the lawyer, who also happened to be the executor of his will, had casually mentioned that she was set to inherit the bookstore. Apparently, my grandfather had never updated his will, and now the business that had been a cornerstone of my childhood was going to be hers. Along with it, I was set to inherit their home, the place where I had grown up and spent so many cherished moments. I was thrilled about the house, it held so many memories. But when I learned that my mother had no interest in running the bookstore, I saw an opportunity. I thought she would understand why I wanted to step in and take charge. After all, I had spent so much time with my grandparents, especially after my grandmother's passing. I had been helping to manage the bookstore's finances, and I felt that I had every right to take over the business, even if it meant running it alongside Stephen. But when I brought it up to her, she told me that she and Stephen had already discussed it, and he was going to take over instead. He would turn it into a franchise and make it a big success. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just unfair, it felt like a betrayal. I had been there, helping my grandfather keep the place running. Stephen had never shown any interest in the bookstore, and now, he was going to get everything? I tried to reason with my mother, reminding her that I had a special bond with the business. I knew it, I had worked in it, and it was important to me. But she wouldn't hear any of it. She was stubborn, as usual, and told me that she had already promised Stephen. He was the one who needed this opportunity, and I had no right to stand in his way. And then, with a tone that I will never forget, she told me that if I couldn't accept Stephen running the business, I could just leave. "You're a grown-up now. Deal with it," she said. Those words hit me like a slap in the face. It felt like she had thrown me out of her life, all over a business I had helped keep alive. It was cruel, and I couldn't stay in that house, not after what she said. So, I left. I never spoke to her again after that. I went on with my life, focusing on school, and when I graduated, I cut ties completely. The moment I realized she wasn't speaking to me anymore, it stung, but there was something deeper gnawing at me. I knew, deep down, that if it ever came down to a choice, she'd pick Stephen without a second thought. Maybe I had always known this, but I had hoped, no, I had clung to the hope that I'd be wrong. And when that hope was shattered, it shattered everything. All the illusions I had about her, about us, vanished in an instant. It was as if our relationship, the years we shared, had never truly existed. With my grandparents gone, I had nothing tethering me to her anymore. No family ties, no emotional pull. So I let go, and for 7 years, I heard nothing about her. I moved to a different part of the city, where our paths didn't cross. We had no mutual circles, and I had made it clear to everyone I knew that I didn't want to hear about her. I didn't need that pain. And so, I lived those 7 years in complete silence about her life, until, one day, a cousin reached out. My mother had been asking around for me. She wanted my phone number, my address. She wanted to come see me. I was taken aback. Sure, I had changed my number when I moved and blocked her on every social platform, but still, after all this time? Why now? I wrestled with it, then gave my cousin the go-ahead to give her my address. Part of me was curious. What could she possibly want after all these years? So, I waited. A day later, she arrived. Just her. Not Stephen. That surprised me. I had braced myself for him to be there, but maybe that wasn't so strange. After all, our bond had never been strong. When she walked in, I wasn't sure what to expect. There were tears. And a reconciliation, of sorts. We talked. She asked about my life, my job, my financial situation. She seemed particularly concerned about how I was doing money-wise, which felt a little off. Sure, a mother cares about her child's well-being, but this was different. Almost too focused on how well I was getting paid, as if that was the only thing that mattered. I told her about Dean, about everything I had built. I tried to remain open, but the questions, they just kept coming. And with each one, something started to feel wrong. It was as if I could see the gears turning in her head, calculating. She was asking about my lifestyle, subtly probing. Could she sense that I wasn't struggling, that I was comfortable? Was this a casual catch-up, or was there an ulterior motive? Then, it happened. The bombshell. She dropped the pretense, and the mask fell away. I'm glad to hear you're doing well financially, she said, because we need your help. And just like that, I was hit with the truth. She wasn't here for a mother-daughter reunion. She wasn't here to make amends. She was here for one thing, money. The bookstore wasn't doing well, she said. Stephen was sinking, struggling to keep it afloat. His grand plans to expand into a franchise? A bust. Multiple locations, none of them selling. He borrowed money from family and friends, and now he needed to pay them back. No one was getting their investment back, and the pressure was suffocating. And here it was, the moment she'd been building to. My mother, sitting across from me, pointed at Dean and casually suggested that since he was going to be a part of the family, he could help, too. I could barely process it. Was she seriously asking my boyfriend to bail them out, as if that was somehow normal? I felt my blood boil. How could she think I would do this? I knew the answer to that. She was only interested in what I could give her. Not in mending our broken relationship. Not in apologizing for the years of neglect. No, she just wanted help. She wanted me to dig deep, to open my wallet, without a second thought. But I wasn't buying it. Not anymore. I told her to leave. I didn't need this. Not after everything. She lashed out, of course. Called me selfish. Ungrateful. She regretted ever trying to reach out to me. The word stung, but not enough to make me change my mind. I had endured too much. And now, she had crossed a line I couldn't come back from. As she stormed out, I felt every ounce of anger I had bottled up over the years spill out. Dean stayed by my side, helping me calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The whole situation was frustrating. Why was it only my mother showing up? Stephen was the one who had made the bad decisions, the one who had put them all in this mess. But no, she came alone, expecting me to fix everything. I was done. I couldn't help them, not when they had done nothing to earn it. Not when they only came to me in their time of need. Days passed. I pushed the entire episode from my mind. But then, the phone rang. It was my mother again. She said things had gotten worse. The business was sinking fast. They had told everyone they owed money to that the bookstore wasn't doing well, and now the creditors were demanding their money back. They had no choice now, she said. The only option left was to sell everything. And then she placed the blame squarely on me. If you had just helped us that day, she said, this wouldn't have happened. She made it sound like I was the reason they were losing everything. And maybe she was right. Maybe I could have helped, but the thought of it made my stomach churn. My grandparents had built that bookstore with their blood, sweat, and tears, and now it was slipping away. I knew the weight of that legacy. But I didn't owe my mother anything. She had never earned it. Still, guilt crept in. I felt it gnawing at me. I didn't want to be the one responsible for the end of something my grandparents had worked so hard for. But there was a part of me that knew I couldn't give in. Not to her. Not after everything. And so, I made a decision. I wouldn't help her. But I also wouldn't let my grandparents' hard work fade away. I had an idea, a way to save the business without giving my mother what she wanted. I reached out to a friend. A wealthy friend who had recently inherited a restaurant business. Together, we made a plan. He would buy my parents out. A fair price, no more, no less. The bookstore would stay alive, but it wouldn't be my mother's hands on the wheel anymore. Now, everything depended on her. Would she accept the deal? Would she finally understand that this wasn't about rescuing her, but about saving something bigger? I was nervous, but I was determined. If this was going to work, I had to act now.